So, I think we should make a start. Hello, everyone. Those of you who are online, those of you who are in person, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's Greek Dialogues, which is hybrid, not just online. It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Anna Rousseau from the University of Patras. He's been in Cambridge this term as a Cambridge Center for Greek Studies visiting fellow, Louis Gibson fellow. Anna, you probably know her. She doesn't need much introduction. She has been a leading figure in Greek linguistics, particularly in syntax, for well, many years. I'm not going to say how many. She's been around for some time. And she's made a good name, not just for herself, but also in Greek linguistics. She's internationally known as a person who has worked extensively on sentence structure in Greek, complementation, the left periphery. And today she's going to thrill us with a topic which is not on any of these. It's a topic that is a very hot topic these days, which is about whether language can be sexist or not. And the case study for this is Greek. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. In the meantime, I'm also admitting Greek.
No, I think it's
great.
Yeah.
So before I start, I would like to thank the Cambridge Center for Greek Studies for giving me the opportunity through the Greek Gibson Fellowship to be here this semester as part of my sabbatical leave. The topic of the talk has two parts. And from Yanni's introduction, you probably figured out that I'm going to talk about grammar and only touch upon language use. I'm not a social linguist, as most of you know. I'm a theoretical linguist. But the reason why I got involved with this topic is because first of all, there is a lot of discussion in the last few years in Greece, I mean, more animated discussion, right? It's a topic that has been around for quite some years now. And because I'm a member of the Gender Equality Committee of the University of Patras, we had to face actually the chairperson, and we had to discuss certain issues with respect to the guide as far as the use of non-sexist language is concerned. So this topic was really triggered by, and in a way, as a response or an inquisition, I would say, to what has been around. So I put the first question, is Greek a sexist language, in quotation marks? Because actually this is not my question, right? It's a question that we see around quite often in public talks or in interviews in the media. Wondering whether Greek should be treated as a sexist language, and I will explain why. And before that, it would be good to just give a very brief definition of what sexism is, as it's given in the European Institute for Gender Equality, EGE, as it is known. It's actions or attitudes that discriminate against people based on the number of gender. And I think already in this definition, we have the answer to the question that was raised below, because attitudes or actions hold of individuals. And therefore, sexism cannot be a property of language as an abstract mental object. Of course, if there are people in the audience who don't believe that language is an abstract mental object, of course, they can have a completely different view of this topic. So what is the property of Greek then that would trigger this question in the first place? That would make us think about it as in terms of sexism. As we see in the definition, right, it says gender, I put it in red. And if we ask what is gender. Of course, there are lots of definitions around. If one opens the Oxford Research Encyclopedia, where it talks about linguistics, you can see a very brief definition by Restream. In everyday speech, the word gender is associated with the biological and social differences between women and men. In addition, people might know that languages can have masculine and feminine words. So at first blush, it may seem that grammatical gender is a reflection of natural gender in grammar, right? So obviously that is exactly as it says at first blush. McConnell has worked quite a bit on this topic, and this is the following interpretation. The word gender refers to the complex of social, cultural, and psychological phenomena attached to sex, a usage common in the behavioral and social sciences. Okay, so we have the distinction between sex and gender. Gender is more tied to social, cultural, and psychological phenomena. And McConnell herself doubts things that using the term natural sex is not in the right direction. And then she says, the word gender also, however, has a well-established technical sense in linguistic discussions. Gender, in this technical sense, is a grammatically significant classification of nouns that has implications for various agreement phenomena. So obviously, what we are interested in, and one of the reasons why this topic is that the question is triggered, is precisely because we use the term gender in linguistics as well, in a more technical sense as a classification of nouns. So if we look at the examples in 1, 2, and 3, in 1, I would say if it is comes to mathema, we use a masculine form. In 2, this is what we have in the recent censorship, all in the grammar. We all count, again, it's masculine. Or in 3, applications to the position of the rector, if this is getting placed in 3, and again, we have the masculine. And of course, one could argue or question these kind of expressions. Are these addressed to males only, given that we have masculine? So if I say this, do I only refer to male students? Of course, that's an expression we use. We use the masculine to as an inclusive term. And the same will call for 2. And again, because we have the masculine nominal noun phrase to frequently, one would argue or make the point that the applications are only restricted to males. So that already sets the background of the discussion. In a paper, I was going to say recent, well, it's relatively recent. It was an interview in, you can see this in Athenarum. I give the link. There is a very interesting interview by Angelique Vanoudius at Williams Lab. And I've just put 2 bits from 2 quotations from the interview. One says, I will just read the English one, language continues to reflect, construct, and preserve male dominance. So one can see that through this approach, the fact that we had the example of an inclusive gender and masculine in the previous transparency, this is perceived as a situation whereby what this reflects is male dominance. And further down, at the level of the language system or grammar, language constructs gender and reproduces male dominance through the grammatical or lexical gender. So again, okay, Sarula, you're very likely to mention your name. You appear. It never works with the lotto. Okay, so as I said, one kind of perspective is that essentially by maintaining certain distinctions, which necessarily, or perhaps not necessarily, rely on having masculine gender as the grammatical gender, that can be interpreted as a way of maintaining the so-called male dominance. So there are 2 issues to be addressed. The first one is what's the role of grammatical gender in nouns when they have the features plus human plus profession. Okay, so essentially, this is where the discussion has been quite interesting, I mean, in various presentations recently, because I think most people focus essentially on these nouns that refer to humans and professions. And also when it comes to the inclusive use like immanentes, ovi, and so on and so forth. So is gender assignment a lexical morphological property, or does it fall outside grammar? That is, it has to do with language use and the speaker's attitudes. And the second question, which of course relates to the first one, is exactly what I mentioned before. How is the inclusive gender issue to be resolved? That is, could we use a binary and ternary coordination, always oli και όλα, to solve the problem, or does this create more problems when it comes to morphosyntax? Okay, so Greek is a language that has a three-way gender distinction. For those of you who know Greek, we have a masculine, feminine, and neuter. So the word typos in 4a is masculine, varta in 4b is feminine, and plio in 4c is neuter. They all refer to non-human inanimate entities. And of course, we all understand that there is no particular semantic reason behind, this kind of gender assignment, why typos should be masculine, varta should be feminine, and plio should be neuter. But this is something that we find when we have the so-called formal gender system. That this is just the formal property that defines this kind of distinctions. Now, when it comes to nouns referring to humans, there is a closer correspondence because in many cases, but not always, when we have male individuals, this will become the masculine grammatical gender. When we have female individuals, they will become the feminine. So in any case, we have a binary system. There is nothing beyond that, okay, when it comes to humans. So you're either masculine or feminine. You're either male or female, but it does not correspond to real life, but this is the grammatical system. So gyneka would be feminine, kori would be feminine, adelphi would be feminine, and accordingly, others would be masculine, yos masculine, adelphos would be masculine. But of course, as has been pointed out many times, koritsi, which is also female, is neuter, and agori, which is also female, is neuter. On the other hand, English has a semantic gender system, that is, there is nothing in its morphology that would reveal what sort of systems we get. And again, if we look at 6, we have clamor. I think most of us here would think of a male. Surgeon, again, I think most of us would think of a male. Teacher, so and so. Priest, okay, if you come from a Greek background, you would think of a male, but here it is also possible to have a female. Okay, so what is the gender assigned to them? Here there is nothing in the grammar that would guide you towards the gender, it would just in these forms. So you just have to build on what you know from your language use in order to provide an answer. Now, when it comes to nouns for professions, we can see that there are at least 3 cases. There could be the so-called epicene nouns, a single gender for both male and female reference, and that would be masculine. That would be the case like γιατρός, doctor, δικηγόρος, a lawyer, which could be construed as masculine or feminine, and this abbreviation has to do with the choice of the article. So I would say for female, η γιατρός, and for male, ο γιατρός, and accordingly, η δικηγόρος or ο δικηγόρος. So any kind of ambiguity as far as the gender, the natural gender is concerned, could be resolved syntactically through agreement with the article. And just bear in mind that the article also exhibits gender distinctions. Okay, this is what we have. I just put here the definite for the masculine and the neuter, and we have a syncretism if we ignore the orthography. If we take photography into consideration, we have a syncretism in the plural for masculine and feminine. If we ignore it and we just look at the phonology, we have a syncretism feminine and plural masculine. The other way is to use derivational morphology. Okay, that would be the case of catechitis, which is masculine, and I can have through the ria the feminine catechidria, and of course on this base I can have all these forestis, ratis, forestia, ratria, and so on and so forth. Or depending on the masculine declension, for my case, I could have Magirisa, Vasilias Vasilisa, or for the East declension, Manalis Manalis. Okay. There are some problematic cases now, which are also existing. And I think that in principle, there are two ways that they could be resolved. If we have, for example, the case of Britannis, right, which is the rector, one way to resolve the ambiguity would be to use the article, the feminine articles, therefore say Britannis, or have the relational morphology Britannis. But the same holds for Bulletis as well, right? And given that this is exactly as in the case of Ratis, Capitis, and so on and so forth, we will have Bullet. Okay, and I think this is something that now becomes very, very common and very productive. Now, keeping apart this to what we want to do, okay, we want to keep these two classes apart, the classes that end in os, and the other ones that you have in B, like Britain, Tamias, and so on and so forth. We want to keep them apart for reasons that will become apparent in a minute. So it's not that we apply, we take one rule, use the relational morphology throughout, right? This wouldn't really work. Precisely because what will put these two noun classes apart is their declension. They belong to different inflectional classes, they belong to different declensional classes. So that was the introduction of the basic data. And now let's think a bit more closely what gender is when we are in a language that has a formal distinction, as in the case of Greek. I think the most well-cited definition is that by Corbett, 1991, that grammatical gender is an inherent classificatory property of nouns. Okay, it's something that we have in our lexicon and arbitrarily assign words to different classes. Okay, it's part of our mental lexicon organization. As Raleigh points out, grammatical gender, when it comes to Greek, is a lexical property of the nominal stem, that is something associated with the stem, people the root. But stem is a more, it's a wider term, we do not want to restrict to roots. And of course, it's a property that can be associated with the relational affixes. What Raleigh points out, and I think this is important, is that inflectional affixes as such do not get gender value, right? They are not marked for gender. And that also Raleigh cites Anastasiadis Sinonidi, and there is a recent work from Ianti in a series of papers that seems to support this claim, that this argument that it's a lexical property of the stem, precisely because children acquire it very early. Now, how do we know that it's a grammatical phenomenon? Because it enters agreement with articles and adjectives. So we have oreos typos. If it is masculine, then the adjective will also be masculine, and the article as well. And we can see that we can test this not only with agreement, but also with binding effects with pronouns. So in English, that should be the garden with his flowers. Ivarka με το Vanitis, the boat with her sailcloth. Το πλοίο με το κατάρτι του, the ship with its mast. And here we have a syncretism between the masculine and the neuter. So we can test that this is something that relates to the noun because we get all this agreement or often referred to as concurrent phenomenon. In the same paper and in a series of other papers, Riley argues that there is no one-to-one mapping between gender assignment and inflectional or declensional classes. And she identifies 8 classes, which is based on stem alone. So just to show here, we have the first inflectional class, which can involve masculine or feminine. So that is a clear case that there is no one-to-one correspondence because the same, we have stem here, we don't have stem allomorphy. We have the os ending, so that determines that they belong to the inflectional class 1, but arbitrarily they could be masculine or feminine. So anthropos would be masculine, progos would be feminine. How do we know? Because we have to choose the corresponding article. And we get the agreement when we use the adjective or binding effects, which will reveal the gender, the grammatical gender. When we look at the inflectional class 2, here we only have masculine, and here I have highlighted the ones in us, like tamias, and the ones in is or thieves, like marketing, because this will be relevant when it comes to nouns for professions. Of course, in inflectional class 3, we have feminine, the same before, and the rest have neuter. And here we should add the ones in us, like grass, stems, and the rest. So the claim has been that gender is a lexical property, and it is either inherently specified, as in the case of tamias, matidis, or it is underspecified, so the value attribution has to take place by in some other way, and that would be the case of anthropos versus progos. At the same time, derivational affixes can also be specified for gender. And how do we know that? Because in many cases, adding the derivational affix changes the gender value. So tokoritz is neuter, okoriteros is masculine. Or an example that figures from ambiguity has used quite a lot. We have to abori, which is neuter, although it refers to the male. Iaborina, which is feminine, but that does not mean that sex necessarily changes because the gender has become feminine. And we can see that we can have the alexia to alexaki, which would be the diminutive. But it's exactly the same if instead of the feminine, I use the masculine Alex to Alexaki, they both become neuter. Okay, and this is a good example to show that if we attach the derivational affix like in diminutives or augmentatives, these are also specified for the gender. Now, let's move to professional nouns. Why? Because these are the problematic cases. And let's look at the inflectional class 1, the ones that end in os, and select those which are specified as class human class profession, like the atros or the gigoros. Of course, we can change despite the fact that the nouns that belong to this class would be feminine or masculine, nothing prevents us from having derivational morphology to distinguish the feminine. And have something like Katrina, female doctor, or Vicky Gorina, female lawyer. Okay, I mean, this is not something prohibited. Whether we're going to use it or not, I think it's really up to us and the register we want to communicate with. But crucially, in the second case, the example we've got in 13, gender is determined by the derivation of affix. Okay. Just recall that this is the class of nouns where gender is underspecified, and it is a result by some other means that is that. So in principle, it could take G here for gender, masculine or feminine, and that will be done at the phrasal level. Other nouns of this class, we have the biagogos. This is an example that Tagalogis likes bringing as a counter evidence because a counter argument, because in most cases, I think we would all, if we hear this word, we would think of a female. Okay, at least in Greece, up to a few years back, this kind of departments were excluded for males, right? They couldn't enter the university. And then if we have the word mechanicos, prototypically we would think of somebody male, but not necessarily, okay? Predominantly it would be, I think, somebody male. There are more cases where we have compounds like glossologos, logos, cardiologos, pharmacopoeios, or derived nouns, like physicos, chemicos. Now, if we want to distinguish the gender, the feminine, nothing would prohibit us from having mechanikina, biologina, physiologina, phenomenologina, and so forth, so on and so forth. So morphology does not put a barrier in that respect. At least I think they are fine. It's possible, but we don't use them. And I think that's a piece of evidence that we don't have to use it because we can, the nouns that belong into this class, precisely because they are underspecified, they can provide us with the right gender specification. Now, if our first thought with mechanicos is a male instead of a female, that has to do with our language languages. Okay, so that's the bit of the use. Of course, we get other pairs with os, daskalos, daskala, which seems to fall more into nosocomos, nosocoma. I think this is the nosocomos is essentially a back formation, because again, the prototypical would be nosocoma. And from that, we would have a back formation nosocomos. In family terms, cuñados, cuñada, okay, or monachos, monarchy, they all come from adjectives, but I'm not going to discuss about it. So one could perhaps suggest that in the same way that we have daskalos, daskala, we can use this kind of derivation for sorting out the feminine. That would give us something like mechanikos, mechanica, biologos, biologa, glossologos, glossologo. We can say that. Cardiologos, cardiologa, physicos, physica, chemicos, chemica, but I think these are all ruled out. Okay. So that should tell us something about the morphological operations in relation to gender as a property of the stem or of the derivational affix. And I think that this really essentially solves the problem that we have with all these os professional nouns. If we stick more closely to Riley's analysis, that the os is not a gender marker, but it is an inflectional class. And I think perhaps one mistake or generalization we make is that we take this precisely because it has the S to correspond to a gender marker, typically, and therefore we feel the need that we need to form distinct forms for the feminine. Okay, let's now look at as or is, which according to the inflectional class, these only they're lexically specified as masculine. Okay, and here we find very productive when we have these or tria. Note that always have a stem entity in two. And it's very productive to have these Mathitria, Gatis, Agatria, and it's very natural to have this Fletria, this Acroatria, and so on and so forth. In some cases, might not quite work out. We have Politis, Politisa. Politria would be a derivative from Politis. Okay. Other formations are Calitectis, Calitectita, Fritanis, Fritanisa. But what unifies all these cases is that the feminine is formed by a derivational affix, but the stem remains masculine. If it was not masculine, then we need to form it with the derivative affix. When we look at nouns, again in the same inflectional class in us, like grammateas or singuleas, here, again, it's not easy to solve. I mean, grammateas could be, the secretary could be either a male or female. I don't think we have anything very domineering in this respect. And there is a potential problem here because this is a class which is restricted to masculine stems. But again, there are ways out. One is to treat it as a medicine and use different at the phrasal level per the article, or we can shift grammateas to the feminine declension. Η γραμματέα is αγγελέα, this grammateas, this is αγγελέας. I think people say both or have derivation. Okay. So these two solutions always work. It depends. If we have papas, we wouldn't resort to e papas. We will say gyneka papas. But also notice that here we have stem allomorphy. Okay, papa, papata, and Yanti mentioned this word yesterday, papadina. We happened to be in concert. The reverend was a woman, and okay, in English you wouldn't have a problem. So one way out, or just use a previous. So we see also the derivation of morphology sensitive to stem allomorphy, that is third and derivational affixes will choose different steps. Here I will just go through that very quickly because I should move on with the discussion. There is a very interesting paper by Leanne and Maria Pasopavu, who have checked the gender assignment on non-words. Why is this important? Because if gender is a property of the stem, it's something that we learn. Obviously, if you are provided with the word which does not exist, you have to use some other mechanisms to decide whether it will be masculine. You have to rely on the suffix, right? Masculine, feminine, or neuter. There were certain preferences, and I think it's just because the subjects in this case really have no other resources, right? So they really have to refer to morphology. And I would like to point out here that if we look at it more carefully, irrespectively of the inflectional classes, all masculines have S in the nominal, right, which is the citation form. Now, Yanti and Maria argue in that paper that to some extent we have to allow for suffixes to be at least partially specified with respect to gender, which could be interpreted as suffixes also selecting certain gender on the stem, and then we have an agreement operation that will do the matching. So just to conclude this part, the second part will be quicker. That professional names are not necessarily a problem for grammar. Affixes are not gender carriers, but they may select stems specified for gender. Whether the reference of a noun like philologos or mechanicos will be female or male, individual, this is something outside the grammar. It's a matter of pragmatics and stereotypical attitudes towards professions. And at least at the grammatical level, referent ambiguities can be resolved morphologically or syntactically. Now, let's move to the inclusive gender. The example that we had at the beginning, where we use the masculine, if it is a masculine, and usually we would answer this by referring to male and female students, or in the example 2. Of course, one could say, is there a reason why the masculine is the inclusive generic gender? Again, it depends on how you see the language. As we saw in the earlier quotations, one would be because it reflects we are really it really reflects what we know from society about male dominance. But it could just be some low-level information that allows us to use the masculine as the generic form. Okay, as far as morphology is concerned, so there are two ways to some suggestions that are around. There are various ways to solve this problem. One is to use both masculine and feminine forms and quite systematically say, if it is this, if it is somatic. This is what I'm trying to do very consistently. Sometimes I do not achieve it very much. Note, though, that this is not gender inclusive. This is binary. Okay, it addresses the females, but it does not include all genders. So the second solution is something that we also find around, is to put the neuter as well. That is, we have the binary and everybody else is new. If it is, if it is, get that, if it done, it's not. Okay. So essentially, this is the ternary distinction, which seems to be more inclusive as opposed to the binary. Now, I'm just wondering, what are we going to do if we want to address people or have the subject with the coordination in the singular? Of if it is, if it is related, of if it don't, it has to maximum. I think that sounds very, very old. We can do this with the pronouns of those of the, but I think it's really strange if we try to do this with nouns, and in some cases we may not even find the neuter. Plus, I think there is another problem here. How is the neuter gender interpreted as not gender at all? Because in many traditional grammars, the neuter would be the case where you don't have a gender specification, right? Or is it inclusive, the one that allows you to address masculine and feminine? If that is the case, then we can just adopt the neuter as the inclusive gender throughout. Okay. I don't have an answer to this, but I'm just pointing out the problems. The third solution is, at least in the written speech, to adopt the ampersand, the and sign, and have something like if you did I don't know if you want to have it as a schwa, it's not so matter. Of course, if we ask somebody to pronounce it, I bet that the first thing that they will say is if it this. And here, because what we have kept is essentially the masculine spelling. If we wanted to be a bit more precise and be inclusive, we would have to put in brackets the R, since we have this with the triad. But there are other problems as well. One thing is that it makes the correspondence between phonology and orthography very clear, and we want to be more transparent. And another one is that if we take the view that whatever possibly we should use feminine forms, even by derivation of morphology, again, that makes this kind of attitude less productive. Okay, because it really obscures the distinction between the masculine and the feminine. Another one that has been around, which could work with some forms, is to have some sort of compound, κάποιος κάποια ενισομά. Or the other one I say, φίλες, φίλια, Πάγιο Βασίλειο, σας περιμένω. Okay, so we could turn this. I think it would work in some cases, but not in all cases. And still, this is binary. It's not all inclusive. Okay. Now there is another, I think, more serious. Finally, I put to syntax. What about syntax? Okay. Even if we assume the coordination to address both male and female students, as in 28, how are we going to handle predicative agreement? If it is, E, S, or secondary predication, either to φοιτητές και τις φοιτήτριες χαρούμεν, τους, S. Okay. One could say, well, if we have coordination, sorry, before I move to that one, just pay attention to this one, because the phenomena agreement in coordination has been discussed in the literature. And usually we have the examples to address the γυναίκα είναι έξυπνη, we can say είναι έξυπνες. Η γυναίκα και το παιδί είναι έξυπνη, I don't know if you could say έξυπνα, but crucially if they are inanimate, it would be ο πίνακας και η καρέκλα είναι βρώμη. Ο πίνακας και το πεζοδρόμιο είναι βρώμη. So the argument is that when we have coordination and predicative agreement, if animus is involved, it is resolved as masculine, but if inanimates are involved, it is resolved as okay. Now there are other cases. Again, we can test this with pronouns. These are examples from pseudo Spartas in the recent paper in Glossa. Κάποιος φοιτητής ή κάποια φοιτήτρια έγραψε το δωμάτιό του. The inference that we have is that each of them paid their rooms. At least this is one possibility. But it would be odd to have κάποιος φοιτητής ή κάποια φοιτήτρια έγραψε το δωμάτιό της. Okay, here the inference would be the room of the student, the female student, but not kind of distributed. Of course, we could say that since we have coordination in the subject, we can have coordination by a conjunction in the rest of the sentence. So say, κάποιος φοιτητής ή κάποια φοιτήτρια έγραψε το δωμάτιό του ή το δωμάτιό της. And similarly say, οι φοιτητές και οι φοιτήτριες είναι χαρούμενοι και χαρούμενες. Okay. Now, the problem is that if we choose the compound solution, κάποιος κάποια, again, we have the problem with the predicate agreement. What we would say, χαρούμενος, χαρούμενοι. Okay. Κάποιος κάποια έκανε την εργασία του, της, τους. Okay. So even we find some solutions to address the subject position, we see that this is problematic. In some cases, we could just use the collective term like fititokosmos or a parenthesis like fititokosmos. But I have the impression that in this case, we would have the collective reading of fititokosmos αφαιτεί τα δικαιώματά του, but we wouldn't be able to get the distributed reading, namely that each of them, each member of the group demands his or her own rights. And just towards concluding the discussion, can I use 5 more minutes? Thank you. What we observed, again, in the same paper, but I think that ties nicely with the discussion we had about the professional names. Pseudo Spartas in that paper, which is actually a reply to Merchant. Merchant discusses ellipses and tries to see under which case you would have gender agreement or not. They say we can identify 3 classes of nouns. Class 1, they have gender inferences. So if I say the denotation of word like adultos, forget the lambda says that it is a property which is attributed to an individual, which has to be male and sibling. Adelphi, again, attributes a property to an individual that has to be female. Okay, so it's not just the sibling part, it's also that it gives you the gender distinction. On the other hand, in class 2 nouns, if you have iatros, recall this is what we would have from Rani's account as well. This is underspecified. It just gives you the property that you're a talker. It doesn't tell you anything about the gender, but of course you can have gender inferences in other ways, that is whether it is male or female. And when it comes to the class 3 nouns, the daskalos, daskala, here, what they argue for is that when we have the male as in 39A, sorry, the masculine daskalos, the denotation that it attributes the property of teacher, but if we have the scala, it's not just a property of teacher, but it is also a property that falls on female individuals. And they give the following examples. You may agree or disagree. If I say ο Πέτρος δεν έχει κανένα γιατρό, that would imply that he doesn't have a male or female. But if we say ο Πέτρος δεν έχει καμία γιατρό, that cannot imply that he has no male. Okay. So he doesn't have a female, but he may have a male dog. And the same with the examples of Petros δεν έχει κανένα δάσκαλο στην Κατερίνη. So imagine that Petros is the head of the school, right? And somebody δεν έχει κανένα δάσκαλο στην Κατερίνη. That would also imply that there is no male or female teacher, but if we use the feminine of Petros δεν έχει καμία δάσκαλο στην Κατερίνη, that cannot be that there is no male teacher in Κατερίνη. And a few more examples. Ο Πέτρος και η Μαρία είναι δάσκαλοι στην Κατερίνη. Ο Πέτρος και η Μαρία είναι δάσκαλοι στην Κατερίνη. So acceptable. O Petrus de Maria Galia 3, 5, O Petrus de Maria Natalesia. Okay, they give many examples of from ellipses and focus. And I think that would lead us to be concluding the second part. That we need to do something about the inclusive gender if we want to be, I wouldn't like to say politically correct, but I will add something here after I just read the first concluding remarks. But first, just to comment on the solutions that are available. If we adopt the coordinate structure of masculine and feminine, first of all, this is binary and it's not and one way. If we adopt the masculine feminine compound, this is also binary. Adopting a coordinate structure does not solve the gender issue when it comes to predicative agreement or phenomenal binding, all the examples that we saw. Gender is a grammatical property. Nouns may be lexically specified or unspecified for gender, which can give rise to different pragmatic inferences. If masculine is the default at the semantic level, and I'm not attributing to this anything more serious than that, right? Nothing about male dominance. It's just a classification because on the base of inferences, it can include the feminine as well. It seems to be the mark to another inflectional level because we call that all these have S as the citation for. It happens with some numbers, but we leave it aside because they don't refer to humans in professions. So we would be dealing with two different kinds of markedness. But we still have to resolve the inclusive issue if we want to, and I think it would be good to try to do it for all sorts of reasons. And I have some serious doubts that it is possible to use a neutral substitute. Okay. Use of gender neutral terms is one option. So if I want to refer to a group of students, of course I can say the doctors because it is lost. This is what we have done in our guide at the University of Paris. Or selecting one form as opposed to the other and alternate and make it clear when we start writing something that we will systematically use the feminine as the inclusive. I'm not quite sure that this would solve all the problems if the data, the discussion of pseudo and sparkles is on the right track, because we have to rewind our inferences the way our inferences work. But I think that would, for the time being, be the best solution. I do try to use both genders. I do try to use derivational morphology when available, like preterist and Vanessa. I work at a university where 1/3 only of the academic staff are women, 2/3 are men. And as I said, yeah, it's true. We can use our language by adapting the professional names to become more visible. But I think there is a limit to this, and we have to take into consideration what grammar makes available. And for me, the most crucial is not so much having the morphological formations. This can be solved more easily, but we really have to handle the morphosyntactic part. Okay, the agreement phenomena and the binding phenomena. There is lots of work on gender. Here, just given the two guides that I found and the references, and thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we can now, have some questions. If anyone from the online audience wants to ask a question, you can either unmute yourselves and start talking, or you can type your question in the chat, and then we will be able to see it. In the meantime, are there any questions from this audience here?
I'm trying to understand some of the morphosyntax, let's say. So if os is doesn't have gender, how do you exclude topic?
You mean the new term?
Yeah, because I mean, where do you, because if it doesn't have a value for gender, how do you, I suppose it's
But
not
it's
like
the same
it's,
as us. Okay, if we take values, I mean, we can modify it accordingly. Because you can have the os with a new term, right? Okay. To cost,
yeah.
okay, so it's not
No,
that os itself is excluded.
Okay.
Right, that's the whole point, that we can see the same suffixes that would attach either to something, but that is there is a declension class, right? It depends on how you're going to inflect your noun. So the kigor, because it refers to human, could be masculine or feminine. I think this is where we need to adjust our lexicon to have it as so that we see everybody. To allow for it, once it enters the class, essentially to give it the possibility of having the feminine as well. Okay, and the easiest way to do it, because in this class it could be either feminine or neuter, right? It couldn't be anything else. Right, that's the restriction you have. That's part of the lexical classification. So you would have anthropos, ipros. So the way to do it is to use the article. Right? In some cases, derivation analysis would work, but it doesn't work in all cases. Okay. So what I want to say is that I'm not saying that we should use only one way, that is the article. Of course, we can say the kigorina, so it should be the reverse. If people say the kigorina, they shouldn't be stigmatized, right? But would they also say cardiologina? I doubt it. And then you can say, well, because it's a compound. Well, then we have to do more serious work with respect to morphology.
I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you think Diabolique, okay, because we think it's almost like the grammar is not the issue here, the issue of the society.
Yeah.
Okay, so why do we want them to introduce this? So we was wondering whether, okay, let's change society and the grammar will be fine because we'll just be using it and it's, we just have, these terms are going to be completely neutral. But is the idea that we want to introduce this term and use them more to, as an act of feminism or to actually raise the idea that it should, okay.
I think that's the point, right? And when people do it, it's precisely because they say, okay, I will mark my profession in the morphology as well, right? Or in the grammar. And fine, you can do it. In some cases, you have to do it. In some other cases, you don't have to do it, right? Because if it's a noun that belongs in this class, you don't really have to do it. Whatever holds for the other nouns, it will hold for this one as well. And it's the reverse. If you try to do it, you may come up with derivations which are really odd. Right? And that's why I gave this example. So you could say, okay, I have the there Didascala, which we could perhaps trace back how it has developed from Didascala stuff. But nevertheless, can we try and do the same for the others? So just choose the a suffix and immediately move it to another declensional class, which will say, okay, this is only for feminine. The result is very low, and I don't think that people really do it. Thank you.
So
There's something that
it wasn't a question.
okay, thank you.
So Yeah, any other questions from you guys online or?
No, everybody was convinced.
Yeah, but it's the point with Wikipedia,
Yeah,
sometimes derivation or like morphology, while we intend to use it to kind of lift this sexist connotation of the language, it ends up having the opposite effect in the case of Wikipedia, or for example, you said physicos ή physica, but then you have like physico or chemico.
Yeah.
And I think when you actually use that derivation, it's the meaning rather than.
yeah.
Yeah.
And again, you would do it, but you would say, mathematical, fine, you know, we can have, it, right? And perhaps this is where now we come to the bit of the language use. By using them very productively, maybe we can help diminish this kind of negative connotation. Okay, but I think we have to be quite clear what we can say, how we can say it, and when, and for what reason. So here it's not a matter of grammar, but philologos wouldn't be in that category because it's a compound. I think we have to check this kind of sensitivity. And I don't think that anybody ever tried to use the feminine for a mechanicos. Πρόσφυγας, προσφύγησα is something that by now we use it a lot. Okay, and we see it written as well. Because there are lots of documents that refer to refugees because of the situation in Greece. So it has something that has been, maybe for somebody who is not, who does not live in Greece, still sounds odd, but many people who live there and we read texts and the newspapers and various documents, by now it's very well.
Can I ask what types of solutions people are proposing for other languages that are facing similar problems?
For English now they use they.
Yeah.
If one gets into the European Union, I didn't put the link here. There's a small guide for each language, how to avoid the sexism. So there is a list of instructions for English, for example, which says use they, and also with respect to certain nouns. You know, instead of fireman, firefighter, and this. I didn't check what they suggested for Greek. Yeah. But it is an issue. I mean, they have the same problem in Italy. Okay, and if Adam Ledger was saying that what they do is they just drop the affix, which in a way makes no sense, right? Because then you know you cannot just have
In writing. In writing.
yeah, I don't know if they do it in the spoken language as well. But in Greek we have inflection on the noun, right? So it wouldn't work. So it would be the equivalent of say he did. If why have the gender? Right? Why have the article? So even if we do this, why would then I use the article? So you know, it's one decision which has a lot of. You cannot just make people from one day to the next to adjust to this, because that means if you really change the syntax of the grammar, and we know that syntactic changes are very easy, right? It's not that they will happen. You can make up new words, and maybe very quickly they become very common, very frequent. But you cannot do this even with morphology. Even more so with syntax. So we need lots of generations. And you cannot expect people of certain age and education to adjust. It's very difficult.
Can I ask something about this last point? So if we are to do something different in terms of being more inclusive, and let's assume that people can agree on some forms for professions that will be gender inclusive. Is this an expectation that, because we know that language changes from the speakers, right? Not top down. So how is that expected to happen? I mean, so does this go against what we have for many years suggested, that we are describing, you know, what we are using? And how is this change going to happen to become more inclusive? That's what I don't know. I mean, psycholinguistically speaking, I don't understand how this can be used across
I think
people from different education levels, people different ages, different backgrounds. What is the goal here? That's what I'm trying to understand. Because I mean, one of the things that we could suggest is that you get something like, as we say in Greek, innate, which is innate attribute, right?
Yeah.
You drop the noun, you keep the adjective, and then you have a generalization there. So you could say something like τα μέλη της φοιτητικής κοινότητας, or you could say τα φοιτήτρια μέλη, and then you drop μέλη and you have τα φοιτήτρια, right? But then it would be from the feminine rather than from the masculine.
I don't think you can avoid, right? That's one thing. The second one is that we will have to regulate, right?
Yes,
So
exactly.
we don't want to be restrictive, but we must regulate it, otherwise how are we going to do it? And you can do it, so who wants to sit down and write the grammar? We'll go to schools, the same ways, but first we need to find the solution. And I think the best that, you know, at most what we would find is to have something which is neutral. But I don't know what format to take. Because as I said, okay, you can have tafitita, and then in singular, to fitito, to matito. And then you would have, then you should do it with all professions. Το γιατρό, neuter, το δικηγόρο, neuter, το μηχανικό, neuter, το γλωσσολόγο, neuter, why not? But are we prepared to do this? I think this is massive, right? You cannot control it, and it has to come in a natural way. So, I mean, there are all sorts of good reasons why we have these discussions in Greece, especially because of the situation. It's a very patriarchal society. We know that, right? There've been lots of femicides. We know that. But if we think about it seriously and see how we could implement it, I think it's impossible. Even if you write, we have to bring good, right? I mean, I heard a colleague giving this talk using both genders and 3 plus the neuter, and it was completely unnatural. Plus, we get really tired, saying, you know, if you do this, if you think there's that, είναι ευχαριστημένοι, ευχαριστημένες, ευχαριστημένοι. Right. So,
Anna, there's
yeah, it's Zeta.
Oh, you have to mute.
Zeta,
Sorry, yeah, my microphone. Thank you very much. It's very interesting. And may I ask a provocative question? Because we are discussing all this time about finding a solution that will be inclusive, but in the end, what means to be inclusive?
Yeah,
I think this is more like redefining inclusiveness in a political way, because in the past, when someone would have addressed me as philologos, I wouldn't feel that I have been excluded because I was not called philologina. And recently, a friend of mine who is presbys reacted negatively in the use of presbina because, you know, she thought it was not appropriate, or it was diminutive. So I think that we have to think again what we mean by inclusive. We define inclusive in a different way nowadays because of political reasons, and that might be fine. But it's not necessarily that it was exclusive a few years ago. I think, and you may want to react into this. And the second thing is, I work in the same university. So as you know, we have been asked to use the two genders when we write, and we all do that. And then we end up with texts that are, instead of being 100 words, and to be 200 words. And we will do that in writing. But if a language needs, actually, if communication has to be economic in one way or the other, I cannot see how we can keep on communicate orally. If we say if it is if it is plus use the adjective with the two different how you say that, catalexis, etc. So between oral and written communication, again, there is a problem. If we want,
It works when you want to write down something with all the problems that you mentioned. But I think at the same time, we're not completely honest because we don't want to discuss gender. We really discuss about men and women, right? We don't talk about gender. So if we include, because gender is something which is defined, it's a sex, and also within sex, it's not you're either a man or a woman, right? We know that there are, you can be transsexual, you can be intersexual, that's one thing. So even anatomically, there is a difference. Plus, with respect to gender, right? So, and I'm saying this because I attended a seminar which had to do with the gender, and the people who were presenting this, and they were very sensitive, they were sociologists, and they were always talking, when it came to gender, talking about women. And there was somebody who was attending Zoom and said, gender issues are not about women, okay? So if we really want to be inclusive, then we really have to think about that. That's very difficult. It's very difficult. So to me, the only part that would justify really being inclusive would be the one that gives you no gender specifications, would be neutral, right? But that means a massive restructuring, which you cannot easily do. This is also a young question. How can you do it? Right? The best you could achieve would perhaps be with some pronouns, but I don't think you can do it in other cases. So yeah, because we are in the situation where we are, the social circumstances are such. Okay, let's promote the more feminist side, but that does not mean that we are all gender inclusive. Okay, and I think we should be honest enough.
Yeah, it's good to be aware about the problem. That's okay. Thank you.
We can use language, but then language is not the only way to undo injustice.
Yeah, and right.
One thing that we have been discussing here is that we are still being cited with our father's name. And I'm not talking about the surname, right?
And not only that, in Greece, we are asked onoma patros.
Yeah, that's
well, in France, once they were laughing when I said,
so
what is your father's name?
Right? Which would be fine if my mother's name was included as well. Okay, so there are these issues.
Can I just say something? I think we will wrap up soon, but just one thing to say, I do understand this argument about inclusivity, obviously, this is what we want. But on the other hand, I have to say that the moving from a male-dominant society to inclusive, leaving aside women, You know, women have been the majority for many, many years, you know, and we're not talking about inclusive minorities here. So I think that the issue with female across professions, etc., is something that is a majority issue.
Okay.
It's not just being inclusive for minorities. And I think that we need to make that clear. It's not that now that we suddenly realize that feminism, you know, is something we should push for. You know, we say, oh no, that's politically incorrect because there are minorities. But one thing that remains unnoticed, perhaps in this discussion, is that women have been the majority, and nevertheless, they have not been the dominant gender, either in grammatical terms or in any other terms. So I think there is something which calls for a more justice, you know, an approach that is more just in terms of minorities. As well.
Yeah, that's what I think, you know, the best thing to do, again, is with the binary distinction, right? So using the neuter, I think it's very problematic, okay? And the reason why I'm saying this is because, you know, there is this move from feminist stance to gender stance. So if you make this move, then you cannot highlight the issue of women only, okay? So I think it would be good to resolve some other problems first, and then also see how we can more inclusive. But I'm saying this, you know, for the people who think, you know, they would use the neuter as well. I think now this is inclusive, right? And I really have my concern about that. What extent it is.
And I think we should stop there. So thank you very much.